Hi everyone, thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So Russell Vought is the man behind much of Trump's agenda, particularly as it relates to the very nefarious sounding Project 2025, which I wish those who voted for Trump that are now regretting that vote would have checked out a little more carefully back in 2024, because essentially through the agency of this man, it's pretty much what Trump is doing. And when it comes to Vought, there is no known birth time. There is a birth date, as is often the case when you have notorious people that are well known, but there's no time. And so we don't know the ascendant, but we know where the planets are, other than the ascendant and the moon. The moon floats somewhere between 16 degrees Aquarius and 28 Aquarius. So he's going to have the moon in Aquarius regardless. And first thing I'll say is when you look into this guy's personality, you discover that he is definitely a true conservative, the old school extreme, on the extreme end. In fact, he is both an ally and a fan of the Freedom Caucus. They're the people in the House of Representatives that go way, way to the right, that first appeared from under a rock back in 2010 during the Tea Party movement and made, I think the guy's name was Boehner, the speaker at the time, made his life nearly impossible, to the point that he eventually quit because he just couldn't get anything done with that crew. But they've remained a force, and this guy is definitely aligned with that type of thinking. He also is known as a Christian nationalist, so you add that onto that, and the fact that he grew up in a very religious family, and that he is apparently quite skillful on the interpersonal level, but nevertheless confrontational and aggressive, and much like the orange president that he serves, he is fond of divisive thinking along the lines of fighting the enemy, attacking, pushing back strongly, confronting literally. And of course you look at his chart and immediately see a cluster of planets in Aries, and that answers your question as to why would he be this way. That's exactly why. You also begin to see that Aries, on the downside, on the lower vibration, let's call it that, part of the sign, is very self-centered. And it's an I, my, me energy, which, by the way, as an aside, though I need to address this in a separate video because it's a bigger topic, but that is really what is currently ailing the world on account of mostly Neptune being in Aries, because it's the longer cycle and more impactful to society at large because it lasts longer, but also Saturn. So you have a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries, and that's one of the results. But this guy is going to embody it in a more specific way, and he happens to be channeling the very rightward impulses of that kind of I, my, me energy, that kind of independence energy. And then you begin to look at what's going on in his chart and how does it align with the charts of important people, most notably Trump's chart. So first with his, what you see there is all that Aries energy, and immediately you know that Saturn is going to pay him a visit starting next year. Already this summer he had Saturn conjoining his Mercury and his black moon, but the only thing we can say at this stage is he was probably working and focusing really hard, because one of the things about this kind of governance is that the extreme nature of it keeps the people that are in power in a kind of feeling of constant siege, because they're so aggressive, they push so hard that they get pushed back. I mean, it's totally normal. If they were more moderate, they wouldn't be experiencing, constant criticism, constant attacks. So in part, you would explain it that way, but now it's going to get more serious as Saturn and Neptune are doing their final sojourn through Pisces, which lasts most of the winter. But by February, they both leave Pisces for good, and they'll enter Aries, whereupon Saturn will cruise through his Aries planets, Mercury, the Black Moon, which is not a planet, but it's a really important abstract position. And then you have the Sun and Eris and Pluto on the other end, and Mars and Cancer. That whole group of planets is getting worked over by Saturn. And I gotta say that on account of that, he falls in the same category as quite a number of these Trump cabinet people that I've come across, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, Kash Patel, planets that are going to run into Saturn. And Saturn is notorious for bringing you to account, for limiting you, for stopping you, particularly when you are exceeding boundaries, which these people are absolutely famous for. So my sense is that because of that, 2026 becomes a huge problem for this guy. There's also the potential for that moon to get involved, because if you put it at the midday position, it's in the 22-degree range, but to the extent that he's born later in the day, then it can pull in more and more the Uranus station that happens in February, which then makes his chart subject to the bigger shock, the bigger unexpected event. But since we don't know 100% whether that's true or not, and if you were talking statistically speaking, it's more likely that his moon is further away from those degrees, because you'd have to be born only in the last quarter of the day for that to be the case. But we do know for sure, though, that the Aries planets, the Pluto over there, opposite, and Mars squaring, all those get affected next year. And I don't think in a good way, because of the way Saturn is. Indeed, his Saturn is in Cancer, and even though it doesn't square the early planets, the Mercury, the Sun, the Black Moon position, it does square Chiron, and this is another pattern that is in play for him. He's on the Chiron return period, and Saturn is moving toward late degrees of Aries, where it'll trigger that square in his chart. That also tends to be quite difficult, though it explains the Saturn in Cancer, in part, the nativism, the everything, America first, the homeland, that becomes the aching tooth when you have a Saturn like this. And then square, even just the sign, makes it a complicated planet, besides which Saturn is not that comfortable in Cancer. It's considered a weak position. So even though he is much, much more disciplined than Trump, nevertheless, that Saturn is problematic on account of being in Cancer, and can therefore deliver really problematic outcomes as a result. So bottom line, in terms of the cycles, this is not a good situation, and he is put in the same group as the several cabinet members that I've covered, which exhibit this kind of pattern. Something else I'll say is that to the extent that you think, this guy has this thing that he shares with a number of these people, they basically tilt authoritarian, fascist. Why? Well, he has Pluto opposite the Sun. There's your explanation, right? That's basically how Pluto behaves. That's Pluto's dark side. That's the nature of the planet. But that also gets a major workover next year, because Saturn is going to go right through those degrees, and eventually at election time station, essentially on the Aries side, opposing Pluto, conjoining the Sun. Not a good thing. And the thing that I'll cover last here in regard to this guy is that his relationship to Trump is something that I've seen repeatedly in the astrological language, meaning all those early Aries planets, including all the way up to the Eris. So Mercury, Black Moon, Sun, Eris, the Pluto on the other side, and the Mars, they link to Trump's Access Hollywood T-square, which is his most vulnerable part of the chart. But you do see this a lot in astrology. You are drawn to people that, in a sense, stimulate your energy. It's where you get things done, and that's why those planets are there. But these also become the people that either turn against you or who eventually harm you through whatever they're doing. And an example here is precisely Project 2025, because my feeling is as this becomes more front and center and we go into the election year, it's going to be more and more difficult for them to explain what they're doing, and it's going to become more and more negative. And so this is something that they have in their relationship, which is initially very stimulating, but then becomes very problematic. And then the Saturn at 26 Cancer is conjoining Trump's Saturn-Venus in the 12th house, which is another signal that things could go completely wrong on that account as well. So, bottom line, let's let this play out. I know this guy scares a lot of people, and yet I have to say that with a chart like this, the upcoming period is really, really tough. And the way it can become obviously really tough for a guy like this is if, as a result of Saturn visiting all his planets, opposing Pluto, squaring Mars, squaring itself, if they lose power, in fact, if they lose part of their power, because this is the way the American system works, if you lose one of the two houses of Congress, basically your game becomes severely limited.